Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Murdoch, and this is Webinars with Wendy. And as you can see, I'm not home. I'm at a barn with horses and dogs and a cart that's going to go by. So if you hear some background noise, I'll try to keep it to a minimum and mute myself when needed. I am so excited to have Alicia Harlov back. Alicia, you are one of our favorite people. When I look at, when I go out and check the stats on the Surefoot Equine YouTube channel and look, you're up in the top. On the top page, along with Bob Bowker and Sharon May Davis and a few others. So well done you. And tonight you're going to talk to us about track systems. But what I'm going to have you do, just in case people don't know who you are, just give us a little bit of your history, your background, how you wound up doing what you're doing now, and then we'll get right into your topic.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Alicia Harlov. I am a PHCP certified hoof care provider and a mentor for PHCP. So I help with instructing students one-on-one in the program to learn how to trim and work with horses' hooves for hoof rehab. I got into hoof care because I had a horse that was diagnosed with navicular disease and basically told that he had to be retired until he wasn't comfortable anymore and then had to be put down. And I'm incredibly stubborn. So I'm still spending, the last decade just looking for answers on how to improve his quality of life. And along that whole journey allowed me to help figure out ways to improve the quality of life of horses that I work with. And I also have done the Humble Hoof podcast for the last 5 years. And last year we opened up a hoof rehab facility here in Amesbury, Massachusetts. And with the hoof rehab facility, we have 2 track systems. So that's something that I'm really passionate about. I first became passionate about track systems 10 years ago in 2014. So a bit familiar with it, maybe not as familiar as some people who have been here and known about them for longer, but something that I think is really beneficial for all kinds of horses.
Yep, for sure. Movement is key. Okay, I am going to make your screen big. And
then should I share my screen?
Yeah, you can go right into it.
All right. So I'm going to turn the screen.
So if people have questions, just pop it in the chat. I'll keep track of the chat because when Alicia's sharing her screen, she can't really see everything. So, and I'll just find the right place to ask your question. But feel free to post your questions in the chat and as we go along.
Awesome. So as I said, I have been kind of interested and familiar with tracks for the last decade or so. The first track system I saw was in England, in the UK at Rockley Farm in Exmoor, and they had a hoof rehab facility. I visited there when I was trying to figure out solutions for my navicular gelding, and I went there, and the first thing I thought was, wow, this is something that I could do at home someday. I didn't have a horse property then, but then my goal became finding a horse property and implementing this so that I could help my horse, but also help other horses. So this is a picture on this slide of one of my tracks on my property. It's actually, we're expanding it a bit into some woods back here. But this was kind of the start of our track rehab here in Massachusetts. So I'm sure that some of you, or a lot of you, this will be a bit of a review or something that you already know, but I saw a few people weren't familiar with track systems. So track systems are just a different kind of turnout environment. So instead of a traditional paddock, where a lot of people have horses that are just in a square, rectangular, whatever shaped open paddock, a track system is paths between resources. So they're narrower alleyways that open up to larger areas where the hay and the water and the shelter might be separated. And typically they're configured so that horses have to travel the maximum amount of distance to get from one resource to another. And that allows them to move more and also interact in a herd as they would in a more natural, species appropriate environment. So that's kind of like a general overview. You can see here, this is that same track that was in the first image. We also have a second track that wasn't in this picture, but we built it on this side of the property over here.
How many acres do you have there?
So we have, our whole property is 21 acres. Right now we have tracks over about 6 to 7 acres, and we have 4 acres of woods back here that we want to expand this track into, and then this field right here is open, and my husband was just telling me this morning, like, we need to turn this field into a track. I like it because it's a nice open space for riding, and I'm not sure I want to convert it just yet, but eventually we might have more acres and actual tracks. All right, so I've talked a little bit about how the track systems are configured to help horses move, but because of the fact that the resources are separate, the horses are kind of taken back to their natural instincts of foraging and moving to get to the next resource. And the narrower paths of the track, so we'll talk a little bit about widths of the track in a few slides from now, but if you have an area that's 12, 16, 18, 20 feet, that's maybe a little bit narrower, then they're kind of encouraged to move through that. They're not going to want to, unless you're some of my horses who feel really comfortable with each other, they typically don't want to like lie down or just hang out in a very narrow space because it's not as comfortable when another horse is coming up behind them. So it encourages them to keep moving. When a horse comes up behind them, it kind of pushes them through those areas. And then it can open up to different hay stations around different areas of the track. And then horses are kind of constantly moving from hay station to hay station, just as they would if they were out, in a more wild type environment. On most tracks that I've been to and on my tracks here, we keep our hay as far from the water as possible. And unless there is incredible circumstances weather-wise, we also don't keep hay or water in the shelter. So if horses, want to get from their hay to their water, they're going to have to move quite a bit. And if horses want to, go under the shelter for half an hour or whatever, take a nap, they're going to have to walk from their hay or their water to that shelter and then walk back. So they're doing miles more of moving a day than a horse that's in a typical turnout environment. And that's been shown through a client of mine actually put a pedometer on her horses and tracked whether the horses were out in a traditional turnout. And I don't know the exact numbers, but her horse in a traditional turnout, I think it was something like, 2 to 3 miles a day out 24/7 in a regular paddock. And when she put them on the track system, it bumped them up to over 10 miles a day. So
I was going to ask you that question if anybody measured. So that's really cool.
Yeah. And I want to do something like that here. It's just been, so that client actually had to put like an old cell phone on their horses and tie it into something in their mane. And I know there must be a pedometer or something that we can kind of attach somehow. I think I've seen people in the UK talk about that. And I want to see if there's something more usable in the States to get that done, to safely attach it and really track how they're doing. So another thing I really like about the tracks here is the herd dynamic and the socialization. I've really seen some incredible bonds in some of the horses here. And it really also is interesting to watch how the herd dynamics also encourage them to move more because these horses are kind of looking to the next hay, or if a horse is eating at one hay station, another one comes up, it keeps them moving than if a horse is standing alone and has no kind of encouragement to move from any outside stimulus.
So somebody's asking if maybe I should tell them, but somebody said dog trackers might be good. Oh
yeah, that's something to look into. I haven't even thought about that because I've never used one before. Does that track mileage or steps, or how does that work?
I'm not sure, but and then somebody said a pedometer on Amazon with vet tape. So there's lots of suggestions that'll come in about how we can do this.
Awesome. Maybe I'll have to do that and do another little presentation about what we found. But
yeah,
really interesting.
Really fun. If you figure it out, I'll put it on mine, and then we can compare. Then we'd have a little study.
That'd be great. So I have a few slides of just examples of tracks around the world. And these first ones are from tracks that aren't mine, but then we'll have some more pictures of my tracks. This is just kind of to visualize what we're talking about before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of more of how to start if you want to implement one and some benefits we might see. So this is an example of a track in North Carolina. Mallory, I'm going to botch these last names, but Moray, I think it is. She sent me a lot of images, and these are just 2 I grabbed from her. And what I found was really interesting with her track is that her entire track here is only 1 acre. So you don't have to have a lot of acreage. And the great thing about track systems is that they encourage horses to move on small acreage. So each of these tracks, hers are like a maze. So she said that she keeps her own personal horses on one of these tracks. So you can see that these 2 shelters here with this is one, and then this is the boundary fence for the second one. And then she has border horses on another track. And I believe she said that just on her side, she has 7 horses and a mini that all happily live on this track. So they have to kind of navigate this kind of maze to move. And you can see where they have some various different hay stations here. So this picture on the left, the far left, is a client of mine that I worked with in Massachusetts, and I no longer go to her area, but she still trailers her horses into my farm. But she has a track on just about 3/4 of an acre, and it goes around this little grassy area and then up through the woods, and her horses were always moving on that. And then this is another track in North Carolina. I liked that there are some examples of some obstacles you can put on them. You know, a little, I think that was a water crossing. It looks like one. So I thought that there's really cool that, you know, it shows different examples of what you can put on to make your track more interesting. And this is a track system that actually is one of the horses that came here for rehab went to this farm after to kind of go back to regular boarding instead of being in rehab board. And this track is Forest Run Farm in Wisconsin. And the owner of this farm said that this horse used to not even be able to walk over gravel. And she said this whole section is gravel. This horse was cantering happily, soundly down this gravel path. So let's see. And then this farm, I think is just so beautiful. I've looked at a lot of these pictures on Facebook. I'm friends with this woman on Facebook. And this track is really cool around her property. And this is more of an example of kind of how mine is set up, where there's a larger area where there's, you know, a hay hut or hay resources that have paths in between them. And then I liked this example of a track with a hedgerow on one side, which I think is often, I've seen more pictures of that in the UK, where there's hedges along one side, things that horses can browse. And this is another, actually, I never even checked to see where this track was. Another 2 examples of various tracks. Meredith is in Georgia, and I've seen her track evolve over Facebook on the last few years. I liked that this was a surfaced kind of sand path. And then Abbott's View Track Livery is one of my favorite ones to follow there on Facebook. It's owned by Amy Dell, and she wrote the book Horse Track Systems. So shout out to her. I absolutely love her shelter loafing area. She has these are actually, I don't know if it's hemp bedding, but it's actual bedding material that are in these kind of stall type areas so horses can lie down. And then this is an example of a section of her track that has a natural obstacle. And then these are all pictures of my track here at home. So I right now have the 2 tracks like I mentioned. So originally these pictures were from the unsurfaced track. We're actually working on surfacing it this year. But you can see just from their movement, it took care of the grass pretty well. So this is the track that's on the far side of our property that goes through the woods quite a bit. And we do actually, in the summer for the non-metabolic horses, allow them to graze, and we rotate their grazing in the inner field. These are also from my track, or my 2 tracks. So this is, again, another portion of that same track that's not surfaced. And this is in the middle of winter, so there's no leaves on the trees here. But in the summer, this is all leaves and even more shade than what you see. And then this is the surface track that I have. So there's stone, dust, and sand on this track, and they live out 24/7. So here you can see, you know, they have a shelter here, the water up here. These are 3 mares that just came up for a drink when I was going to do night check. They came up to say hi.
Somebody's concerned. They're wondering about, like, you have trees. Okay. Do you have to be concerned with toxic trees?
Yes, so we do talk about that a little bit in a later slide. I will say that I did talk to my vet about that. My vet came out before we actually even started building the tracks to kind of take a look around and see if there's anything that I should remove. But yeah, and that's going to vary on what area you live in. I wouldn't even begin to speculate. I know I've seen a whole ton of people complaining about toxic trees in the UK right now. I think I'm not even going to pretend to name the trees that they're mentioning that we're dropping the little pods right now. We don't have to deal with that, luckily, but there are people that I have trimmed for that have built tracks that have had to avoid, black walnut trees, maple trees, that you want to make sure that the horses won't chomp on. But typically,
we have a lot of cherry.
Yeah, and I'm sure, it's definitely regional, but you want to make sure that that's a consideration. We will talk about that a little bit more too.
Okay.
So obviously, that's just kind of an overview of what a track system is. And as a hoof care provider, why do I even care? Oh, sorry, the table there. So how does this play into body and hoof rehab? So this is a case that we'll talk about later, but this is just a few months on the track and seeing some changes in his feet. And really the biggest difference, because his diet was pretty much the same before he came to my property, was the movement on the track. So the big thing that I see as an improvement in the whole horse and especially the feet is movement. So this is a picture from my friend Kierley's farm in Kentucky, Redemption Farm. She has an absolutely beautiful property with a really well thought out track. And just I loved visiting her and seeing her horses move on her track. So the big thing that I kind of harp on, I know Dr. Bowker harps on, is that the hoof is a neurosensory organ. So the hoof is responding to the environment that it walks over. It's taking that stimulus. It's, just like if we go to the gym and we're working out and using different kinds of weights and doing different kinds of exercises, our body is going to change. The hoof and the internal structures are going to change based on what it's moving over and how much it's moving. And I know that obviously I have a hoof rehab facility that focuses on lame horses. And a lot of times people are worried that a horse that is lame shouldn't be moving, or, there's a focus on stall rest to rest injuries. And I will say a few comments that I think every single horse that is...
a little bit, Alicia.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
It's okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. It broke up a little bit when you talked about horses on stall rest.
Oh, sorry about that. So I will say that every single horse that has come to my property, I believe every single horse has had a soft tissue injury within the hoof capsule, at least the rehabs, I should say. And I still had them on the track system. So these are horses that maybe doing something else like stall rest wasn't working. And so this was kind of a last ditch effort, last resort. So something that I focus on is movement itself isn't the enemy, but improper movement is. So if you have a horse that's stuck in a stall for a large portion of time and then turned out and they're so excited, they have all this pent up energy, they're galloping around, they're yahooing around, they're going to be stressing those internal structures. Whereas if this is their horse's normal living environment and they're constantly having to move, there's no new exciting thing because they constantly have access to hay, they have a herd that they feel safe with, they have an area they feel safe in, and they're moving enough where they're not having that anxious pent up energy. Ideally, their movement is going to match their comfort level and what their structures can handle, and then their structures can slowly strengthen. And along with that movement is helping their body, their joints, their muscling. It helps with increasing perfusion and circulation throughout the body and throughout the hoof capsule. Movement can help in pain reduction, not only in joints and in muscles and stiffness, but there's some evidence that past the acute laminitis phase that horses that are dealing with laminitis can actually get a reduction in pain from movement as they are allowed to move to their own comfort level. And as I mentioned, being out 24/7 allows for that less anxious or pent up energy as they're kind of constantly using and regulating their energy. And it can act as physical therapy for the soft tissue in the hoof capsule, which we've seen time and again here. And something else I really like about track systems, which I think really it helps a lot with the body as well as the hoof, is lower stress. So horses that have constant access to all the resources they need. So something that might be a kind of catchphrase that you've heard before is the friends, forage, and freedom. If they have constant access to friends that they feel safe with, to constant access to forage that they don't have to fight others for, that there's enough forage and enough hay stations carefully put out where everybody can safely graze or eat their hay and not feel like they're fighting another horse over it, and constant access to movement, they're going to, over time, as they get acclimated to this environment, start to feel safe and realize that they have everything they need. And as their kind of stress levels go down, there's better gut health. And I mean, constant access to forage absolutely also helps gut health. But that gut health is so important for absorption of minerals, for, the ability to just regulate their own emotions. And I've seen horses that come in here stressed out that used to live in a stall for 23 plus hours a day that now are two of these horses in these pictures came to me living in a stall nearly 24 hours a day. And here they are just lying down, taking a nap with part of their herd. So once they feel comfortable and they're able to just relax in their herd, I've just seen their body change a lot as they're feeling more regulated in their body, and their hooves improve so much, which obviously can be from a lot of factors, from movement and diet as well. So that's a very brief overview of track benefits. And because my main focus today is kind of talking about some cases and hoof rehab, I'm kind of zooming through some of this, but I know that a lot of people might not actually have a track system yet. I know I saw some people mentioned it, but for where to start, this is something that is going to be different for every person and every property. There's some books that I'll mention at the end for you to check out to dive in deeper, but I'll kind of go over a little bit of basics of what you can do if you want to implement this or improve a track that you already have. So one thing that I wish I had more time to do is identifying a path, ideally by seeing your land through various seasons. And the reason is, for example, we bought our property in the dead of winter, and we had no idea where water would flow or pool or, where drainage issues were until we had monsoon type weather in the end of spring. And so that's something that if in an ideal environment, you can walk your property, take notice of the topography, look at where things are draining. That's going to go a huge way in preventing mud if you're not planning on surfacing right away. So surfacing your property is where you're going to be adding stone and various surfaces that they're going to be moving over so that you're not dealing with just dirt that turns to mud. Because as much as you think that your grass track is going to stay grass, if you have horses living on it 24/7 and living on it 365 days a year, if it's enough horses on that track, they're going to turn it to just dirt. So identifying a path that accounts for moisture, water flow, low and high areas, drainage, where the hills are, if you need to add in steps or surfacing on the hills so it's not slippery, you have to think about the different seasons and what that land is going to look like through various seasons. We're on an incredibly steep, hilly property, and it's been fantastic for a lot of top line, hind end improvements, but we have had to take that into consideration as we work on the steps and the grading of the property to make sure that it's safe for horses to be moving over. And as we mentioned with Wendy before, checking for toxic plants. So this is something where if you've identified a path that you want to take, you want to walk that path and make sure that there's nothing that your horse is going to eat and get sick from. We did go around and chop a bunch of things down and pull some things out. And as sad as it was to kind of get rid of some beautiful, scenery, it was important that we didn't have anything that was going to make those, make the horses sick. And as much as horses who have access to 24/7 hay, typically if it's hay that they find interesting enough, they'll want to eat that. There are always horses that are going to nibble on things that are not good for them. So it's definitely something to check for. And the last thing that you definitely need to make sure that your horses have access to is shelter. Especially, and I guess that truly depends on your environment, but here we have all 4 seasons. We can have very hot summers, we can have very wet springs and falls, we can have very snowy winters. So access to shelter, and a shelter that is going to be large enough to accommodate all the equines that are going to be sharing that space. And, you know, here in Massachusetts, we do have to have a man-made 3-sided shelter for horses. But, you know, I find that a lot of times the horses on my property will go under the trees in a storm. They prefer to be under the trees than in the shed. But at least they have access to both.
Yep. Somebody's asking about the picture on the right. I think what you're trying to show us there is what happens in mud season.
So we added these in mud season. So this is mud control grids, and we're really fortunate to have a dealer that's only like 45 minutes from us. But these are amazing because you don't need to have any prep. I do not make money from them. I don't sell them. I'm just
no.
I'm not, you know, but so this area is our muddiest portion of our entire property. In the worst of it, because we got so much rain this past year, this was up above their fetlock when they would walk through it. And we have, you can't tell in this picture because it's not a great example. We have a huge French drain that goes all the way across this track and goes, you know, across 3 acres. It's the lowest point of the property, well, of that track. And the French drain still couldn't handle, you know, professionally done French drain still couldn't handle how much rain we got. So these grids we put down with 0 prep. We didn't have to scrape. I was in muck boots where the mud was, you know, mid calf, and I was laying down these grids, and within, you know, 5 minutes of putting them down, the horses knew right away that they could walk right over that.
They're plastic grids, right?
Yes, yeah, they're plastic, and they're about 2 feet by 2 feet each, just under that. So they don't cover a huge amount of space, but you can link them together. You can slice them if you need to and kind of configure them whatever way you want. This is another example of, this is not the same track. This is another track, an unsurfaced part of our original track. And around the hay hut, we put a whole bunch of the grids. My cat is playing with something, so hopefully it's not too loud for all.
It's okay. Yeah. So the original ones, there was gravel pave and grass pave, which was kind of the original idea of a grid that you could put stone over, like for your driveways and stuff, so that the rainwater could go through. And this is kind of like the several generations later where they've come up with these. I saw them back in Switzerland in the 90s, and because they have much smaller space, so they needed to be able to control the surface and keep it from eroding and turning into muck and everything else. And it's just something that's coming over here. I think with more track systems, we're going to see more of this. But yeah, it's super easy. No, like you say, no prep. You just put it down. The horses go, oh yeah, this is great.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's really great about that is that if you don't own your property, like say you're boarding your horse at a barn, these aren't inexpensive. For people in the United States, they're actually quite expensive. I hate to say it. They're worth every penny, but they're expensive. They're made in Germany, I believe. So in Europe and the UK, I think they're a lot less expensive than here.
Yeah, because we're importing them, right? That's
right. And they're heavy. I mean, each individual one is manageable, but once you get a whole pallet of them, it's quite heavy. So it's something where if you're boarding, you can lay them down, and then if you're going to move, you can pick them all back up and put them somewhere else. So this year, we're spending a lot of time surfacing this track, this one on the right. So we might end up taking these and moving them onto a different spot, or just saving them for, you know, if we need to top up our surfacing, and we won't do that during mud season because you'll just lose it anyway. So they're a really great investment. And if you ever end up reselling them, they typically sell used for almost as much as new. Because
they don't wear out.
Right. They're nearly indestructible. They're pretty fantastic. So that's just a little mud management tip.
Yeah, whereas you could be putting stone down and it would just, in certain certain types of dirt, it'll just keep disappearing.
Right.
Right. And then that'll come back later.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, we used to grow rocks in Connecticut.
I
every
know.
year.
Yep. It's so true. Yeah. I mean, that's one thing is that, as much as it's difficult to see all the mud in the worst wet seasons, there's nothing you can do about it permanently that's going to be any good if it's actively mud season. So as we're trying to get through the worst of it, laying down these mud control grids was a really fast and easy way that wasn't going to just get lost. Whereas if we had just tried dumping stone on that, it would have been lost really quickly.
Yeah, it's good. And people are wondering, are they slippery and that sort of thing? But they're going to get dirt and stuff on them, and no, they won't mold. They're plastic.
Right. So the company does recommend putting sand or some kind of surface over them. This was pretty soon after we laid them down, but now there's a thin layer of dirt that covers all of them, so it's not slippery whatsoever. Same on these. But some people have said they are slippery if you don't put something on top of them. I, knock on wood, have never seen a horse slip on mine, and watched that happen today just because I said that. But this one here, this is my gelding only track, and those boys are so playful, and they will canter up and down this all day long and give me little heart attacks. And you can hear it go like, all down the plastic, and they're fine. I mean, there is that little layer of dirt now.
Right. And they do smush down into some degree. So they're not just sitting on top.
Exactly. Yeah. So a few more considerations for if you're looking at building a track. One big thing that you have to think about is how many horses are going to be on that track and how wide do you want to make it? And how well do your horses get along? Because if you have a herd that's changing, like my herd is changing certain times a year as we get rehabs in or rehabs leave. So we have wider open spaces and wider width of track that if one horse is standing sideways on the track, ideally another horse can go next to them and pass them without feeling too nervous about getting by. The only downside to that, or one downside to that, is the wider you make the track, often the less stimulus there is or encouragement there is to move, because it's more like an open space paddock. And also, the wider you make the track, the more grass is going to grow if you don't surface it, unless you have a ridiculous amount of horses on there. So we last year had a very, very hard time keeping grass down on our first track because we have areas that are 20 to 30 feet wide, and the horses just would move over one little section of it like they would in the wild. They pick a path and they just kind of keep going over that. And so next to it was all grass. And we spent so much time rototilling and dragging and scraping and spraying with vinegar and doing all things. And it just kept growing back because it would all wash away with the rain, all the things that we tried. So that's something to consider, is how many horses are on the track. How well do they get along? If they get along super well, you can make it more narrow. I know that Jamie Jackson talks about having tracks that are 9 feet wide. I don't have any portion of the track that narrow here, but again, I don't have horses that are, 100% a constant herd all the time. I would say most of my track is 16 feet wide, and I have typically 5 horses at a time on each track. I have, once I expand it more, I have the 4 acres on one side that I'm going to add in. I might include more, but honestly, 10 horses at a time is about all I really feel comfortable caring for with my trimming business as well. So that is, something that you really have to think through and think, where can we put these resources that no horse is going to get pinned, and no horse is going to feel like they're having to fight over any kind of resource. So another thing that I worked really hard on is avoiding corners. I worry a lot about a horse trapping another horse into a corner and them not having a way to get out. Obviously, we do have corners in the sheds. That's also something I still worry about. I have friends who have kind of opened up a side of their sheds so that if a horse wants to scoot out, they can kind of not feel trapped if another horse is causing a problem. But here, because we get such strong winds at times and pretty strong storms, I want them to have a 3-sided solid shelter. So one way that we've remedied it, when we had a horse here on this track that was a little bit more of a pushy kind of resource guarding type horse, was adding this overhang allowed everybody to happily share this space for this track. And nobody felt trapped, because if one horse was less comfortable being in this actually enclosed space, they were standing under the overhang, and getting blocked. The wind was getting blocked from the space behind it. I also mentioned, ensuring the resources are not in small spaces. So like here, the water, I have it so that, if anybody's coming up to get the water, they have this whole space behind them that they can kind of scoot out if some other horse comes and wants to push them away. I don't want any of the resources like the shelter, the water, or the hay feeders to be in a spot where they're going to, if, another horse comes up behind them that really wants it and wants to have what they're having, they're not stuck in a spot that they're going to injure themselves. And I think we kind of mentioned this in the last slide, but checking the soil consistency and surfacing, that's something that you can really see best when you see your property or the property that you're looking at building a track on over various seasons. Because my property right now, with it not having rained for a bit, is super solid, rock hard, not any mud anywhere. But if you had seen this track in January when it wasn't cold enough to freeze, which is unusual for our area, and just had been raining almost every day, there were some spots on this track that were quite muddy, like I showed you with the mud control grids. And so that's kind of helped us decide, where do we want to add surfacing? Where do we need to make a plan for making it a safe passageway? And where can we figure out how we want to keep it a smooth area? Because when it gets cold here in winter, it freezes. And if you have mud and it turns into this lumpy mud, that's very not good for soft tissue in the hoof capsule, which is what we're trying to strengthen here.
Yeah.
So the surfacing for hoof health, this is another cool project that I really enjoy working on. There's so many, as we said, the hoof being a neurosensory organ, there's so much feedback that the hoof can get through moving over various surfaces and exposing the hoof to various surfaces to move over. So this track, the reason I have this picture is because it's actually, we've surfaced more of it since this picture was taken. This entire aisle here, or path here, is all sand. This entire path here is all gravel, crushed stone. This area here, it wasn't in this picture, but this is now all stone dust. We also have the stone dust here in the mud control grids. We have, this is actually another crushed stone area, and then we have areas of large rock right here that they have to almost jump over. It's 6-, so it's bigger than anything else we have. And ideally, we're going to be adding more surfacing, so this entire track is surfaced hopefully by the end of this year. And then we have areas of pea gravel as well. So all of these are different substrates that give the horse and the hoof different feedback, whether it's how deep the hoof is navigating through that footing, or if it's a harder surface that's helping with a callus layer, things like that. So obviously it's going to be dependent on what's available in your area. Amy Dell, in her book, the Horse Track System book, she talks a lot about limestone, crushed limestone. I cannot find that anywhere here. It sounds like it's an awesome surface. I just can't find it here. So we've gone with the stone dust for a lot of that. Crushed stone, pea gravel, sand. And what we've had to do, or seen the most success with, is making a plan by scraping the topsoil, putting down a base layer that drains well, and starting with a larger rock as a base layer and making it smaller until you get to the surface that you want. And on hills, that can be incredibly difficult, because if you have a smaller type surfacing, like a smaller consistency, if it's not large rock, if it's pea gravel, if it's stone dust or sand, if you have it on a hill, it will wash away unless you do something like water bars or steps to hold that surfacing in. And there's a lot of really cool resources to help with that. The NRCS is a resource in our area. I think it is national for the United States, that they can help you to implement water bars, implement animal tracks, or animal paths is what they call it. And they can help with consulting to see what might work well for this space that you have. And that is something that I feel like we will be working on for the rest of our lives on this property, because with each season we have to adjust the footing or continue to upkeep the footing that we've put on our track.
Somebody's wondering how deep the sand is in the sand part.
I'm honestly not 100% sure. It was professionally done, so we didn't do it ourselves, but it is deep enough that the horses often canter or gallop down that space and their hoof does not dig through to the bottom layer, or the layer under that, which is, we have a stone dust layer under that, and then below that is a few layers of gravel and larger rock. But at least a few inches. And our stone is like I don't know exactly the name of it. I don't know if it's like sand. It's like a masonry type sand. And it's not a deep footing. Even though it's a few inches deep, they're still kind of, it's almost like the consistency of like a wet cement when it's wet. So they're kind of floating on the top of it, almost like the consistency of when you're riding on the beach. Sorry, I realize I'm on the coast and maybe not everyone has done that. But if you're below the frac line where the tide comes out and you're riding on that smooth area of sand, that's kind of how it feels here on that area when it's wet. And when it's dry, it's a little bit harder, actually. It's pretty firm. And one thing they didn't mention about the stones, so like I said, we have all this crushed gravel here. I don't know if you can tell, but the little edge of this is an area that they can walk around the crushed gravel if they don't want to actually walk on the gravel. But usually within a few months of being here, all the horses are walking over all the surfaces without noticing any difference. So
you give them an out in case they need it.
Right. Because if I'm forcing them to move, I don't want to force them to move that's making them uncomfortable. And we do use, we'll talk a little bit about this too. We do use boots and pads for horses that need it. But I also, give them 1 to 12 hours a day out of the boots, depending on how far they are on the rehab. And I want to make sure that while they're out of the boots and their feet are airing out, they have somewhere comfortable that they can move if they want to.
Somebody's asking how you manage manure.
So we pick our tracks, pick the manure off our tracks 1 to 2 times a day. We have a manure pit where we compost it, and our neighbor has a manure spreader that he has so amazingly, graciously said we can use, so we can spread it on our fields. If that wasn't an option, there are places that pick it up, but we do compost ours.
And somebody's wondering, like, you've got the grassy area in the middle. Do you use that for grazing in the winter, or what happens there?
So we rest all our fields in the winter because our winter, if it isn't frozen, this year was pretty warm, because the grass isn't growing, all of that would get torn up and overgrazed and turn into a mud pit eventually. So for the health of the soil, health of the roots, health of the grass, they're on the track full time over winter. So we have non-metabolic horses that we do rotational grazing through the summer through fall, and we wait until the grass is tall enough. So at least 6 inches tall, but often I wait until it's even taller than that, so that it's a lower sugar, higher fiber grass. And then only the horses that are not metabolic will rotationally graze through that. And once they graze the grass down to about 3 to 4 inches, I move them off of it so that the roots have a chance to recover, and they're not overgrazing to where the grass is stressed and higher in sugar. So we do only graze them certain, while the grass is still growing, so it can recover easily, because horses are very, very hard on grass. It's not like a sheep where it's actually a regenerative type grazing, where the sheep are naturally fertilizing the soil in a way that they're like little tiny hooves are kind of harrowing it into the ground. Horses are pretty hard. They kind of rip it right down to the soil. But yeah, we want to keep our fields healthy so that, healthy grass is going to be not stressed grass and ideally lower in sugar. And then the taller is usually the better.
They don't like it as much, but yeah.
Right, they don't. And it's so funny, people don't believe me, but yeah, if you get tall grass, it's like starting to turn almost yellow. Like it's less palatable for them.
My horse protest. I don't want to go on that grass. It's not nice. It's
right.
Somebody's asking about propensity for stone bruises and gravel problems on your track system.
So I I find that stone bruises are a result of an unhealthy hoof and thin soles. So if you have a hoof that's not healthy and they're put out on surfaces that their hoof can't handle, then yes, they can get stone bruises or abscessing. Horses that come here for hoof rehab that have a weak hoof, they're going to be pretty much immediately put into boots and pads. And when they're out of boots and pads, we have hoof armor applied so that they have an instant callus layer. It's a Kevlar-based epoxy that we'll use. But even so, I think in the last year, we've had one abscess here, and that was shortly after pulling shoes on a horse here. And we've had one stone bruise in a year, over a year. So I think that, the healthier you grow the foot, and 90% of that, 90% of hoof health is diet and metabolic management. So if your horse is getting lots of stone bruises or has thin soles, the first thing I would check, all my geldings are just cantering down the track right now. Sorry, got distracted. I'm sitting right next to the boys track. So as I was saying, is that, if you have a horse that's dealing with chronic abscessing, thin soles, stone bruising, then the first thing I would do is double check the diet, do a metabolic panel for blood work, and make sure that your horse is on a barefoot friendly diet, because that's going to grow the healthiest hoof possible for that horse. But again, we try to make it so that they can walk around surfaces that might bother them. So this is a part of that sand path that I was showing at the top of this. This is the sand path. So this horse was lying down. This opens up right here to a little sand pit kind of area. So this horse was lying down right here. And it's funny, I wrote accommodations for sore horses. He was not a sore horse in this. He was just taking a little nap. But this is, a soft, nice surface that horses that might have weak feet are happily, comfortably moving over. And if I have a horse that's very sore, that's newly introduced to the track, a lot of times I will only feed them, only put the hay out for them on the areas that are on this nice surfaced, comfortable spot until that new horse has started growing in a healthier foot and acclimated a bit. But other than that, my big thing is do not force a sore horse to move beyond their ability. So obviously that's difficult because track systems are set up to make horses move. And we want and need the horses to move to recover, but you have to do it within their time and within their comfort level. So this is going to sound maybe a little controversial, but my first big thing is that I don't want to mask their pain. So I've had horses come here. Now, I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not giving any recommendations, but for what we do here, I've had horses come here that are on, I had one horse come here on 2 grams of bute and an equiox per day and was still lame. I had another horse come here on 2 grams of bute a day and was head bobbing lame at the walk. And one of the first things that we did, the owner and I worked to do, was transition those horses slowly off of those NSAIDs and onto something like Jaugulon, which is a vasodilator herb. Dr. Kellen talks a lot about it. Mad Barn has a really good article that has a lot of information about the studies done on it, that has some analgesic effect, but it's not going to mask pain to the point where these horses are moving above what their internal structures can handle. Because something that I feel really strongly about is if a horse's pain is masked, then they're not going to know how much to limit their movement to allow those structures to rest. Obviously, as a person, we can take some pain management, and we know that the doctor said, you're on this pain management so it doesn't hurt, and you're going to be in bed until X, Y, and Z. I don't ever want horses in pain, so that's why we use those kind of herbal options, and we use boots and pads for comfort. But they also need to know that they have to limit their movement. So we do use boots and pads for horses that are coming in that need extra protection. Almost all the horses that have come here came in pretty fancy corrective shoe packages, variety of glue-ons or nail-on shoes. And I have done extensive glue-on shoeing in the past, but for horses on my own property, I've spent a lot of time, working with them to just use the boots and pads and the hoof armor, because I see the fastest changes in their feet when their feet are interacting directly with the ground. And that's also because I have the option here with the surfacing to make sure that they're moving comfortably. So I also have had horses that if they are acutely sore, that there's a separate space that they can be on where other horses aren't forcing them to move. And they're also closer to the resources so they don't have to move as far. So, we had a horse that moved here that couldn't necessarily keep up with the herd. And so, we put some hay nets very, very close to the shelter and the water for him so that he didn't have to move as far as everybody else to get to anything. And as we're doing
Somebody want to know what kind of boots you use.
So every horse here uses Easy Care Cloud boots. They're a therapy boot that comes with an EVA foam pad. And I find that I have never had a horse dislike those boots except for once. And that horse that was sore in them had an acute soft tissue tear where the pad was too much of an instability for them, for that soft tissue that was trying to stabilize their joints. So we use those. They're very, very easy to put on and off. They're very accommodating size-wise, where these horses' hooves change so dramatically in a fairly short time here that I need the boots to stay on, whether they're just out of shoes or whether they've been here for 4 months and then they're a totally different shape. But, there's a whole bunch of options. I know that Gosworth Track Livery in the UK uses Equine Fusions. I've used those as well, and I do really like them. They're a little bit harder to get on and off, but they're very, very durable. They can also accommodate therapeutic pads. I've had horses that have come here with cavallos. I've had horses that have come here with scoop boots. I don't think that scoop boots are often the best option for hooves that are going to be changing a lot just because they're more fitted to a performance type hoof. But there's a whole bunch of options that you can look into. All right. So one big thing we also do here is we closely monitor the changes in the horse's individual hoof health and comfort. So I am, when they first come, I do an intake where we take hoof pictures, we do a slow motion video of their movement, and then at least once a month, on the same day that they moved in, we do an updated video and pictures. And sometimes it's more than that. If I feel like I notice a change, or if I feel like, there's a significant difference in their movement, I'm going to be recording that, whether that's only a week later or somewhere in between that 1 month time frame. And that gives me feedback of how quickly I can start to transition them out of the boots to allow their hooves to get a chance to breathe and interact with the ground more. And if I need to make any changes to their diet, if I need to make any suggestions to the owner about maybe having the vet out for various reasons or to do blood work, we're closely monitoring that so we can make sure that these horses are constantly progressing in the direction we want and not having setbacks or not stalling in their rehab, which can be really tricky because every horse is such an individual. So the next whole bunch of slides are going to be examples of rehabs that have been here on the track system. And I'm happy to answer as many questions about these as anybody wants. So this horse is a teenage, I think he's 14, Dutch harness horse. He's over 17 hands. He must be like 17 too. He's very tall. And he came to me with the primary complaint of navicular bone damage with corresponding soft tissue damage. So he had DDFT tears and collateral ligament damage in his right front foot. And when he got here, the first thing we noticed was that his hind end was his tubercocci, so his points of his hip on his hind end were completely in different spots, which you can see in this first image. He actually came in August, so this is even after a few months. His left one was much higher than his right one, and my vet came out and found out he had a broken pelvis. So this was not something that happened with his current owner. His current owner is absolutely wonderful, but she got him from, he was a previous cart horse, and they think it might have been a cart accident where, he ran into something on the side. He was the right horse in a cart in a double. I don't actually drive, so I'm not quite sure how the terminology is for that, but they think that he might have hit something and then this, slipped and then healed down here because it likely wasn't addressed. So this was just between October and January. The biggest changes we did for him was we obviously pulled his corrective shoeing. I don't have the images of the corrective shoes on here. I do have them in his album. Every horse here gets an album that the owner has access to, so they can every single day check on new pictures. But he came here in corrective shoeing, so we pulled those, put him into boots immediately, and we transitioned him off NSAIDs, and which was very hard because he was very sore originally, and it was pretty hard to watch. We didn't know if he would really, we didn't know what to expect. And within 2 to 3 months, he was moving almost soundly around the track, and now he's been here 8 months, and his owner is just starting to bring him back into work. So the biggest thing for him was removing his shoes, using the boots and pads, living on a track system, so moving 24/7, whereas before he lived in a stall 24/7. And he had a similar diet in his old home. His owner was trying the best at a boarding facility. So she fed whatever the barn had for hay, and then fed the Vermont blend, which is just a kind of a catch-all vitamin mineral supplement. And here we test all our hay and we balance the minerals to that hay test, which kind of helps you hone in on what the horse actually needs in terms of what's deficient in the hay. So it helps us to hopefully target a little bit more of what they're getting for what they need. So that was one big difference, is that I wish I took an updated picture now, because he's even more balanced here, much better relaxation through his hamstrings, better muscling, better top line. He was very high-low, so he had a left front that was more upright and a right front that was a lower angled hoof, and it's balanced out quite a bit. And he used to stand with his front legs completely spread out almost all the time. And he would park out with his hind legs way out, like a cart, like a pulling horse, like way out behind him. And now he chooses to stand square 90% of the time.
That's a crazy picture of him standing there from the front, okay?
Yeah, and this was just like last week. So some of these pictures were very recent. So these images, the biggest thing, I know it might not seem like a lot, this is the same horse, is that this was from his intake video, where you can see the distance between his hind limbs before he hit the ground, where now it's just much more extended. He went from on all 4 feet being toe first to now extending and landing heel first on all 4 feet. And this picture I took 2 days ago. So this was actually, this image I think was a month after he moved in. So you could see that this tuber cocci is just, it's kind of crazy how his hind end was just very under-muscled, tense, tight. He would always hold his tail slightly up into the right. And now it's much more relaxed. He has his winter coat now too. So this was just us trying to brush it, and it ended up just looking more dusty than clean. So this is another horse we have here. She is a sweet, sweet paint mare that came here with, again, a primary navicular bone damage diagnosis. She also had surgery before she came here, a year before she came here, on her right elbow, where they found a cyst in her elbow, and they actually put a screw in it to encourage the cyst to fill in. And we did updated radiographs after she moved here and the cyst had filled in. So ideally that accomplished what they wanted it to. But her MRI also revealed that she does have soft tissue damage within the hoof capsule in her front feet. So this is actually a hind foot. These pictures I just happened to take around the same time, because I noticed that there was a big change between how long her toes were and kind of run forward her whole foot was. And this was actually earlier this year. So this might have been in January or February. And then noticing this change in the top line in her hind end, and less tension through those hamstrings. So I know a lot of people will tend to look at images of horses and think that they're muscled if they have these lines. But if you see these lines on your horse, it often means that they're actually tension lines. You don't want to be able to see these lines. So the fact that these muscles have actually relaxed, and she has gained a little bit of weight in a good way. She was like a 3.5 on the body score scale when she moved in. So she's at a healthier weight now, but she's also just gained a lot of top line and reduction in tension. And when she moved in, she was toe first, even in boots. So that's uncommon. I would say that most horses, once I put them into cloud boots, they're instantly willing to extend and land confidently on their foot, on their heel. And she was not. She was just so tense and tight that she was still taking these tiny little steps. And now she is happily heel first. And she's very heel first in boots, and we've now finally transitioned her out of boots, and she's 90% of the time heel first barefoot as well. This is the same horse, so you can see that she had a very poor top line when she came in. You can see here that she was standing square in this. I know it doesn't look like it, but it was like her spine was almost like tilted to the right, her whole hip. I'm not great with the upper body, I should say. My focus is on the distal limb, but you can see that her body was just not super strong when she moved in. This was obviously over the winter, and this was over the winter too, but she filled in top line wise and has a much better evenness through her hind end. Again, standing the exact same stance, her left front slightly ahead in both images. You just can't see it with the tail there, but you can see her right front there and right front there. So this is the same mare, and this is her front feet. This was only a few weeks on the track, actually, like 10 weeks, I guess, on the track, where I noticed that her frog had opened up quite a bit. And you can see that her old hoof is still growing out in this image, so she has that wall separation. Her toe came back quite a bit. Some of that was us trimming. Some of it was just growing in. You can see here a tighter wall connection where this angle is coming in tighter from diet changes before it kind of flares out. You can see that she had incredibly different mismatched front feet. So her right foot had a taller heel, more upright angle, and her left front, she didn't even have a heel on this hoof. It's hard to tell, but this is actually her heel bulb here that's sitting on the ground, and her heels just run forward there. So she actually started to grow some heel and balance out between her two fronts. And that was just a few months on the track. She's still here. So she's been here almost a year, actually. This is a gelding that was only here 4 months, and he had kind of miraculously came up sound that he went home after 4 months, and now he just trucks in for me to trim him as needed. So he was the biggest horse we've had here. He was an 18-hand warm blood gelding, and he had navicular bone damage and pretty not great soft tissue damage within the hoof capsule. And the owner had spent 2+ years trying to rehab him. She did everything the vet recommended. She did stall rest. She did tons of corrective shoeing. She did all kinds of different therapies. And finally, the vet was recommending either neurectomy to cut the palmar digital nerve so he couldn't actually feel anything in the back half of his foot anymore, or euthanasia. And this, if you met this horse, he is literally the sweetest animal in the world. When he got off the trailer, I was scared because he is huge. And I thought, oh my goodness, what did I think I was getting into? Like taking this huge animal to put out in a herd that, what if they don't get along and he hurts one of them? And he is just the gentlest, sweetest boy in the entire world. And I still miss him. He was just so amazing to have here. My husband was like, I miss him all the time. But his feet, pretty instantly with him coming here, he was sound in cloud boots. And the funny thing to me was the owner was like, why didn't we ever try this before? Maybe he didn't even have to come to me. Like maybe if he just got put into cloud boots and the diet changed from the beginning, he might not have even needed to, move as much on a track, but I do think the movement helped him to gain the strength in his foot before he went home, the internal structures. So, when he first came, he had these overgrown bars. His walls were just awful. Like instead of chipping because they were so flimsy, they would just fold over. And he had, white line disease, delamination, wall separation. And this isn't actually a trim. This was him just kind of breaking off all of this foot here. And as short as this looks, it looks like he has no wall because he didn't at that point. I wasn't even trimming him. I was just rolling off the chips from the top. He was comfortable over all surfaces in these pictures. He was walking over gravel, trotting, cantering, doing flying lead changes on the track, looking like the fancy dressage horse that he was. And all I was doing was just kind of rolling off those chips from the top as his foot grew in. But you can see here that even his heel angle was just so collapsed. on his fronts. And then before he left, they were actually he had a pretty good solid heel. And this is actually his feet a day before he left. And I used Metron Hoof to put a marker in there so I can actually measure the exact changes on their feet before they leave. So he had a slightly wider heel here, just 1%. But again, it was only 4 months, so his new foot hadn't actually hit the ground yet. It was still growing down. The separation between the weight-bearing part of his heel was almost, a centimeter more, or maybe 3/4 of a centimeter more. His heel bulbs were farther apart, so had decontracted a bit. It says here, his toe length, this was confusing that it seems to have gotten bigger. I think that is because the software actually picked up a part that was further back on his foot than where his heel actually hit the ground. Because if you looked at his feet, in and of themselves, I don't think that his toe was actually longer. Whoops. And yeah, overall, he had just much stronger, like if you palpated his heel bulbs here, if you squished between where the heel bulbs were, where the digital cushion is, it was a much firmer, like like a rubber eraser type texture, as opposed to kind of like a squishy, weak digital cushion area. And his bars and wall just became basically self-maintaining. So when he trucks into me, really only every 8 weeks or so to get like a nice little roll on his walls. And the owner does a lot of just kind of keeping the toe rolled too. So this mare, she was actually only here about 2 months. I usually say that horses have to be here a minimum of 3 months if they're going to be here for hoof rehab, because you don't actually see a good new growth come in before that. But this mare was only here for a few months. She had ring bone and she was very young. She was 3 years old. So it was very sad that she had extensive ring bone at that age. But even just a few weeks on the track, I had done a light trim, but she came here having been trimmed 10 days before she came. So she was growing at a crazy rate when she moved in. She had been trimmed. She was just throwing out tons of hoof. And being on the track, she was moving so much that she was kind of wearing it on her own. And much more sound, and her frog was, you can't really even tell because this image is darker, but it was so much more plump than even in just a few weeks. And this mare is the one that moved from my track system to that one in Wisconsin after she kind of graduated the program. So she's a draft cross, kind of warm bloodish type mare that came in with a caudal hoof pain, some evidence of possible laminitic issues in the past on her radiographs, and these chronic event lines and just run forward hoof. And within a few months, she just had a much healthier hoof capsule. And she went from, lame head bobbing at the trot, sometimes head bobbing at the walk, uncomfortable, to rock crunching sound over all surfaces, heel first. And her owners bring her back into work now. She wasn't here. She was only here I think she ended up being here for 6 months. So a fair amount of time. And then this horse was only here for a month and a half because the spot for retirement that he was going to opened up. So this picture is still terrible. His hoof is not healthy in this. He was a huge warm blood gelding. He had negative palmar angles on his fronts, negative plantar angles on his hinds, and he was only here just under 2 months. But the new growth that he had at the hairline, this steeper angle here, was just from diet change, pulling his shoes, and him moving on the track. So ideally, this angle will continue to grow down and bring his whole capsule more under him and elevate that palmar angle. Because you can already see that, his alignment's better just in 2 months. So he went down to Virginia to retire. And he came here really to transition to barefoot, and she thought he was going to stay here over the winter until that spot in Virginia opened up, and then it opened up early. So these aren't hoof examples, but they were rehab cases. So this Welsh pony came here with pretty extensive arthritis and would, lie down a lot, have trouble getting up from lying down, have trouble holding up his feet for trims. And he lost some weight in a good way. He was a little bit chunky when he came, and he became much more fit. And by the time he went home 7 months later, he was the one that was constantly cantering from one hay station to the next, able to get up easier, able to stand better for his trims, just much happier in his body. And he's close to 30. And then this horse is the same one in this picture. You can see he came very underweight. He was a rescue. And he was severely, severely foundered in his hind end. Like some of the worst rotation I've ever seen in the hind end, and only the hind end. And we were very worried about him if he was going to have to be put down here, just moving here, because of how extensive the damage was. He came up sound very quickly. He was only here 3 months and went home. And just being on the track really helped to having constant access to safe hay, helped him to gain good weight, like a healthy weight, not overweight, and helped him to gain some muscling through some areas where he needed it. So the resources that I would say that are way smarter than I am, because I'm still, I've only been at this property a year, so I'm still continually improving my tracks. Horse Track Systems is such an amazing book. It's written by Amy Dell Anthony. She runs Abbott's View Track Livery. If you want a step-by-step how-to, that is the book to get. It is the most comprehensive book, or most comprehensive resource I have ever seen on track systems. If you have questions about anything from feeding to surfacing to building a track to plants and things to look for, I mean, it's UK based, so it's toxic plants and stuff in the UK, to hay, to introductions, how to introduce new horses onto your track. That book is amazing. And then obviously there's the first book I think ever written on track systems, Paddock Paradise by Jamie Jackson. He's the one who kind of coined the phrase, the term Paddock Paradise track systems, and kind of got the whole idea started. And that book is more of a conceptual book. So it talks about, what track systems are, why they are helpful with horses in terms of their like natural species appropriate environment. And then Gosworth Track Livery. There's so many track liveries. It's the UK term for like farm boarding facility. There's so many track liveries on Facebook. A lot of them are so great. Gosworth is one that I really love to follow because they post a lot of their track system, of how they do things, how they feed, how they take care of horses' feet. They post a lot about laminitis cases in their rehab. So that's a really interesting one to follow to see how they run things. I have a podcast called The Humble Hoof that has a handful of episodes about track systems. I also have some ebooks. One that I just published this year called Navigating Navicular. If you have a navicular horse, that is pretty much my entire approach. Like if a horse comes to me with navicular, what do I do and what can you consider? And what are the steps that you might follow to help them be as sound as they can be? And then I have a workbook that is helping you to keep track of progress in hoof health. And then this is my 5th webinar with Wendy. So Wendy has 4 webinars where we've talked about diet very in depth. I've talked about navicular in depth, transitioning your horse from shod to barefoot, thrush and frog health. So those are 4 that I've done with Wendy before, but she has so many webinars that are amazing about so many topics that would be helpful if you're really considering hoof rehab or looking into having a healthier horse. So that's the presentation that I had. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Why don't you unshare your screen and then I'll go back. Somebody's asking if you test hay and get supplementary minerals, how do you feed each horse, or do they all get the same thing?
So I have, so I do test my hay and I supplement minerals, and each horse gets something individual to them and the calories that they need and their metabolic status. So I separate every horse for feeding. Some track systems I know, or some boarding barns I know, will bring them inside to stalls. I don't do that here. We do have a barn with stalls, but I don't bring them in. I separate them in separate electric fence areas along the track so that they're not, I make sure they're eating their own individual meal that they're supposed to eat. because some horses, if a bigger horse, because minerals are dosed by weight, they get more than the pony that we have here. So yeah, we separate them and make sure that they eat exactly what they need.
Do you have a section in the grass area that has other edible foraging?
So our grass is not a uniform species. So we have a whole all different kinds of grass. I wouldn't even be able to tell you what they are exactly, but we don't have, I do want to implement a few more browsing areas that have different things like herbs and stuff that they can safely graze on. We do have on the unsurfaced track an entire side that's a hedgerow. And again, I can't tell you everything that's on it. I have an app that I take pictures of plants and it tells me what it is to make sure that nothing is toxic. But there is a hedgerow that they kind of like look through, but my fields themselves are just grass right now.
Okay. Somebody says they have a surface track, no mud, but it's been cautioned that thin-soled horses will wear hooves faster. So adding alternate surfaces, but have you experienced that as a hoof care provider, that thin-soled horses wear their hoofs faster?
I don't know that I've noticed that necessarily, but I will say I do use hoof armor quite a bit if I know a horse has thin soles, because I don't want to end up with any, compromised corium, any sole bruises or anything like that. So the hoof armor itself, because it's a Kevlar-based epoxy, prevents wear. So that could be why I haven't noticed that. And a good balanced vitamin mineral supplement helps them to grow healthier hoof. And I think the movement as well, because of the increased circulation, that's also helping to stimulate better growth. So we see much faster hoof growth here. And almost every horse here is on that vasodilating herb that I mentioned. So that helps to very much increase hoof growth. I
think, okay. I'm glad we're getting toward the end because my battery's getting low,
no.
But it's still okay. It's okay. So let's see. I've heard track systems for metabolic horses. Curious about, I think she meant hoof rehab for the pictures. I think you've answered that. So somebody's asking, I think one of the questions that I saw kind of going through, and I think this kind of covers several of them, is it's better to have a dirt track than have no track at all.
Yes. So I just had a podcast where I interviewed Amy Dell, who wrote Horse Track Systems, and we were lamenting about mud because I published it at like the height of the mud here. And I said it then, and I will say it again. I've seen the horses here have better feet living in the mud here when it was mud season than when those same horses came to me having been grazing a grass field. So I saw healthier hooves, but to caveat that, they have spaces on the track to get out of the mud. So they're not forced to stand in it 24/7. They have shelters. They have some surfaced areas. Even on the unsurfaced track, we had put down some areas of surfacing to get them out of the mud. They have some of the mud grids. So it's not like they're forced to stand in it. But I see better feet on a dirt or mud surface than horses grazing, even if they're not metabolic. As long as you're meeting their needs in their diet elsewhere, I just see such better feet that way.
Yeah.
And they're moving on the track.
Well, and that's just it. I think the bottom line is that horses are designed to move. And I think some people just kind of looking at the feed and stuff, I mean, what you have set up is amazing, and you've done it actually in a very short period of time. But there are ways to just get horses moving simply and easily. So don't be intimidated by having to have all the different surfaces and all of that stuff. Just that's what I've done where I live. We don't have any topsoil on the fields because it was gone a long time ago. Just get them moving. And that's made just a massive amount of difference.
Yeah. And even if you can't implement a track right away or at all, even if you can separate your hay as far from your water as possible in the paddock, and sometimes that's a little inconvenient for us people. But to me, the extra bit of time that it takes to separate those resources just has exponential improvements for the horse's quality of life and their bodies and their hooves that I don't mind taking the extra time.
Cool. All right. Well, Alicia, we got to wrap this up because I only have 18% left on my battery and I don't want it to die. How can people find you?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me directly at thehumblehoof@gmail.com. I also have my website, thehumblehoof.com, and the podcast, The Humble Hoof. Feel free to reach out if you have any other questions, and I'll try my best to answer. And those resources I mentioned are super helpful for going into more information than I even know. So I hope that helps.
Yep. And we'll let everybody know there's a lot of people that signed up for this but didn't show up. And of course, we send everybody an email and let them know when the video is posted. So stay tuned. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining me. Have a great week. And thank you, Alicia. I really appreciate I know that you've had a pretty busy year. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. See you. Bye.
Bye.